The clock had no hands, yet it ticked. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Share your location in the comments. I love mapping our mystery circle. You make each story feel alive. Let's begin. The village of Charnley Street Mary was not famous for much. There was a Jacobean dovecote in the churchyard that made it into a county brochure once, and a footpath that rambled politely along a brook where nobody ever drowned. The houses had hedges that bloomed in neat succession, lilac to rose to clematis, like the pages of a well-thumbed gardening almanac. Gossip bloomed just as methodically. On the morning of the Garden Society's summer fete, the green behind the vicarage was already humming with preparations. Paper bunting trembled in the breeze. Mrs. Rudge was shrieking at a boy who had upturned a crate of rhubarb jam. Colonel Fanshaw's retriever had eaten 2 sausage rolls intended for the cake stall, and at a shaded table near the hollyhocks sat Miss Jane Marple, knitting needles clicking gently as she observed it all with that mild, inquisitive gaze that made her so forgettable to the guilty and so quietly terrifying to the observant. Miss Marple had never much liked the Garden Society fete. It was less about gardens and more about being seen, not to care who was seeing. But she came each year, as she had promised the late Mrs. Reeves, and as the villagers now expected of her, polite, forgettable, and very precisely dressed in lavender. The morning passed with the usual blend of disorganization and pride. A cello duet played Greensleeves to an audience of dozing retirees. 2 young women in hats far too large for their heads spoke sourly about each other's marigolds. And then came the announcement that drew the first real spark of interest all day. "Everyone to the vicarage drawing room, please," called Mr. Lathbury, chair of the society. "Mr. Glynn will unveil his latest horological treasure, something rather special, I believe." There was a shuffle of bodies and parasols as the fete guests made their way toward the vicarage. Mr. Glynn, retired antique dealer, local eccentric, and collector of rare clocks, was not especially liked, but he was tolerated for his odd charm and even odder artifacts. Everyone remembered last year's display, a Flemish mantel clock that struck 13 at noon. This year's piece, however, sat singularly unimpressive on the vicarage's sideboard. "It's broken," someone whispered. "No, no," Mr. Glynn said, clapping his hands for attention. "She only appears broken. She ticks, but without sound." His eyes gleamed. "This, dear friends, is an 18th century French parlour clock. The case is ormolu, of course, and the mechanism has been modified. Silent as the grave, one might say." "Delightful," murmured Miss Hartley, who looked as though she'd prefer an actual grave. Miss Marple moved to the back of the room, the better to observe the crowd rather than the clock. There was Mrs. Penelope Eastgate, recently widowed and dressed in cautious navy, young Arnold Dacre, whose father's estate had crumbled into scandal, the rector's wife, appearing slightly more flushed than the wine she'd been sipping, all the little threads of the village, woven in a room and straining quietly at the seams. The demonstration was brief. Mr. Glynn wound the clock, held it up, and insisted that if one placed a hand just near the brass face, one could feel it tick. "Not hear, feel. A marvel, yes?" The guests murmured approval, but the energy had shifted. It was too warm in the room, or perhaps too tense. A few excused themselves before the raffle began. Miss Marple did not. She remained seated by the window, quietly knitting, her ear attuned not to the raffle numbers, but to the conversations that now grew curiously tight. Mrs. Eastgate was whispering to Mr. Glynn in the hallway. Arnold Dacre had disappeared altogether. The rector's wife asked whether the clock had ever belonged to someone notorious. And Mr. Lathbury, who'd arranged the whole affair, kept glancing toward the clock with an unease that didn't quite match the occasion. When the fete concluded just before 5 o'clock, the air outside felt too still. A silence had crept into the hedgerows. Miss Marple walked home slowly through the lanes. A boy on a bicycle sped past her, shouting something about Mrs. Eastgate fainting. She turned back toward the vicarage, but before she could reach it, she saw the commotion herself. Two constables standing at the front gate, their expressions grave. Inside, the drawing room was now a different stage. The raffle baskets sat forgotten. The cello duo had gone home, and at the foot of the sideboard where the clock had been, lay Mr. Glynn, face down, quite unmistakably dead. Miss Marple, arriving quietly beside the hedge, saw no signs of violence, but her eyes flicked, just once, to the ormolu clock, still ticking in its silence. She narrowed her gaze very slightly. "Well," she said softly to no one at all, "that is peculiar." And in that moment, something shifted, not in the village, not yet, but in her mind. A thread had been tugged, a memory unearthed. Somewhere beneath the polite horror and fluttering fans, Miss Marple already knew that the death of Mr. Glynn would not be so very simple. No, not with a silent clock and a room full of motives. Not in Charnley Street. Mary. The constables had already cordoned off the drawing room by the time Dr. Penrose arrived. A man of tidy moustaches and untidy paperwork, the doctor was as brisk as he was bored. He bent over Mr. Glynn's body with professional detachment, his leather bag already yawning open on the vicar's rug. Miss Marple, standing quietly just outside the French doors, saw the subtle pinch in his brow as he examined the man's wrist, then his mouth. "No visible injuries," he murmured to Constable Greaves, who had the polite stiffness of a man overwhelmed by the presence of doilies. But the expression, see here, mouth slightly ajar, a faint clench in the hand. It could be cardiac arrest, or poison. Not something immediate like cyanide, more subtle. Could he have just fainted and hit his head? The constable offered, though weakly. Dr. Penrose shook his head. No trauma, no bruising. Besides, he's cold. Rigour has already begun. He straightened, adjusting his cuffs. We'll wait for the coroner, of course. But I'd be cautious. This doesn't feel accidental. Miss Marple had not moved from her place at the edge of the threshold. She did not wish to intrude, not yet. Her knitting bag hung loosely from her wrist, one half-finished rose-coloured cuff peeking out as if in anticipation. She watched everything. The way the rector wrung his hands by the drinks table, apologising uselessly. The way Mrs. Eastgate hovered in the hallway, eyes darting nervously. And the clock, still sitting exactly where it had been placed. Silent, ornate, innocent-looking. What struck her most was not the clock's silence, but the attention paid to it. Every eye had wandered to it at least once. Every voice dipped when they mentioned it. Arnold Dacre returned then, flushed and breathing hard, explaining to Greaves that he had only stepped out for a smoke. The constable nodded but jotted it down anyway. Arnold's gaze fell to the body and he flinched. "Good God," he whispered. "Dead?" Dr. Penrose gave a curt nod. Miss Marple allowed herself a gentle cough and stepped into the room. The constable's shoulders lifted when he saw her, as if at once reassured and wary. "Miss Marple," he said, "it might be best." "I know," she said kindly, "but I think I'll just sit over there, out of the way. I was present, after all." Constable Greaves hesitated, but the vicar gave a faint nod from the corner, and Miss Marple settled herself in a small chintz armchair beside the hearth, her knitting once again in her lap, though her fingers remained still. "You said poison," she murmured thoughtfully once the doctor stepped closer. "Would there have been any opportunity for it to be administered here? During the fete, perhaps?" The doctor arched a brow but answered. "Possibly. Drink, perhaps. Or something on the skin. Arsenic preparations, digitalis. There are a few types that act subtly and take effect only after some time. But that would imply intent." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Yes, that's rather the troubling thing, isn't it?" Out in the hallway, murmurs rose. Mrs. Eastgate had seated herself on the edge of the umbrella bench, her expression fixed and pale. The rector's wife had produced a damp handkerchief and was dabbing at her temples with great ceremony. Arnold Dacre stood in the archway, arms folded tightly. Young Mr. Dacre, Miss Marple called gently. If I recall, you were admiring the clock quite closely during Mr. Glynn's demonstration. He turned, blinking, uncertain whether to bristle or indulge her. I was curious, yes. I've never seen one tick without sound. Quite eerie, really. And you went outside before the raffle. I needed a cigarette, he said quickly. All that perfume and jam gave me a headache. Miss Marple smiled. Of course. And you, Mrs. Eastgate? The woman looked up, startled. Me? You seemed quite taken with Mr. Glynn's piece. I believe you whispered to him just before the drawing began. Mrs. Eastgate flushed. Oh, well, it wasn't anything. I was simply inquiring whether the clock might be available for donation. The Historical Society in Morton has been looking for items. He said he'd rather die than let it leave Charnley. She gave a tiny, embarrassed laugh. Did he now? Miss Marple said lightly. There was a pause. Dr. Penrose closed his bag with a snap. I'll send for the coroner, he said. I suggest the room be kept sealed. Constable. Of course, Greaves said. No one in or out. Miss Marple rose slowly. I'll be on my way then. I expect you'll want formal statements later. Indeed, said the constable, though he looked rather as if he wanted her to stay. As she stepped into the soft dusk outside, Miss Marple took the long way round the vicarage to reach the lane, passing beneath the open study window. A low voice floated down, Mr. Lathbury's, tight and agitated. Told him not to bring that blasted thing. Said it would stir things. He said it was important. Miss Marple paused, pretending to fish in her bag for a dropped thimble. Another voice answered. Female, older, trembling. It was always important to him. He never let it go, not even after, well, you know what happened to his sister. Miss Marple blinked once, then moved away, footsteps silent on the flagstones. By the time she reached her little gate, she had decided not to boil the kettle just yet. Instead, she sat in her sitting room, the ticking of her own modest clock loud and reassuring. A sister. That was interesting. Mr. Glynn had never spoken of any family. She reached for the Charnley Parish Gazetteer, a bound volume kept beneath her writing desk, and turned to the pages for 1917 through 1922, the war years and the aftermath. She recalled a story, something tragic, something whispered, but wanted the names. And there it was, Miss Beatrice Glynn, aged 24, drowned under disputed circumstances. No inquest verdict returned. Case closed. Miss Marple closed the book slowly. South A clock that ticked in silence. A man who refused to part with it. A whispered reference to something buried long ago. And a gathering of people, each with reason to smile too thinly at Mr. Glynn's death. It wasn't proof, but it was people. And Miss Marple, more than anyone else in Charnley Street, Mary, knew how very little. People changed, even after decades of pretending they had. Outside, the sun had sunk behind the lane. A breeze moved through the hedges, carrying with it the smell of cut grass and distant lavender. Inside her cottage, the only sound was the soft, consistent tick of a very ordinary clock. Miss Marple listened and waited. The investigation had not yet begun in earnest, but already she felt the first outline of the truth. It was not sharp, not yet, but it was forming, quietly, precisely, as all truths eventually did. The morning after Mr. Glynn's death dawned oddly bright, with a sky so pale it looked freshly scrubbed. Charnley Street. Mary stirred to life in its usual rhythms, but beneath the familiar sounds, the milk van chugging past the post office, the church bells marking 8, the fluttering of lace curtains, there pulsed something new, a thin cord of tension. Doors opened just a little wider. Greetings lingered half a second too long. The village had slipped into its old habit of watching itself. At number 2 Church Lane, Miss Marple was already seated at her breakfast table, spooning grapefruit with a precision that was habitual. not distracted. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. The Gazetta remained open on the armchair beside her, a linen bookmark nestled beneath the entry for Beatrice Glynn. She had made no assumptions, not yet, but her years in St. Mary Mead, and the uncanny mirror it held to Charnley, had taught her one thing. When a death followed closely behind a long-forgotten tragedy, the two were rarely strangers. She finished her tea and pinned on her hat with a firm hand. There was a method to this stage of inquiry. Not direct questioning, not yet. One listened, one watched, and one appeared gently where one might be least expected. Not to demand, but to knit, to muse, to quietly remind people of what they themselves had long forgotten. The first stop was the churchyard, under the pretense of checking on the gravestones she had offered to help catalogue. Reverend Hale's wife, Margaret, was already there, a pad in hand, looking flustered in the shadow of the stone lich gate. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said at once. "Thank heavens! I told Dennis you would come, though of course you weren't obliged." "I rather enjoy old names," Miss Marple said gently. "They tend to repeat themselves in the strangest ways, rather like habits." She bent to brush moss from a small weathered stone and let the silence sit comfortably between them. Eventually, Margaret spoke again, a little hesitantly. "It was dreadful, about Mr. Glynn." "Yes," said Miss Marple, straightening, "though I dare say he wasn't a man who invited warmth." Margaret gave a tight smile. "Number. But he was respected, in his way." "Did you know his family well?" The younger woman hesitated. "Only vaguely. There was an older sister, Beatrice. Died young, long before my time. People used to say, well, I shouldn't gossip." "Oh, I quite agree," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Still, things do have a way of lingering, like a scent in a wardrobe." Margaret looked away. "There was some talk, years ago, about a quarrel. She had a suitor her brother disapproved of, I think. It ended badly. They said she fell into the river near the old mill. Some thought it wasn't an accident, but there was no evidence, and no one ever proved anything." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "What became of the young man?" "Oh, I don't know. Left the village, I imagine. People don't like to be reminded of such things." "No," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "They certainly don't." She made her goodbyes shortly after and walked the lane toward the general shop, where the bell above the door jangled and the air smelled of chalk and barley sugar. Mrs. Finch, the shopkeeper, looked up from behind the counter with the brisk cheer of a woman who had never missed a whisper in 30 years. "Well now, Miss Marple," she said. "It's not fete day again already, is it?" "Not unless time has played a trick," said Miss Marple, smiling. "I was just in need of some lavender polish and perhaps a moment's news." Mrs. Finch's eyes gleamed. "You'll have heard, then. I was there, you know." "Oh, of course you were. And wasn't it odd, him just falling over like that? Not a drop of blood, not a cry, like one of those painted dolls." Miss Marple accepted her tin of polish with a nod. "I've been wondering," she said lightly, "if he had many friends left in the village." "Friends?" Mrs. Finch snorted. "He had buyers, he had bidders, he had people who wanted what he wouldn't sell. But friends? I wouldn't say so. Except for maybe Penelope Eastgate. Though that's more recent. She visited his shop often after her husband passed." "Ah," Miss Marple said. "And did he return the attention?" Mrs. Finch narrowed her eyes. "That's the thing. She'd linger, ask about clocks or brooches, and he'd bark and shuffle about, acting put out. But I'd wager he didn't mind. There's a kind of companionship in repeating a pattern." "And young Mr. Dacre?" Miss Marple asked, as if idly. "Now that's curious," Mrs. Finch said, lowering her voice. "He was in that shop 3 times last month. Said he was looking for something to do with the estate. Wanted a conversation piece, he called it. But the way he looked at that clock when it came in, well, it wasn't interest. It was something else. Apprehension, maybe." Miss Marple offered a soft smile of thanks and made her way to the church green, where she paused on a bench near the war memorial. Children were chasing a hoop across the grass. Somewhere, a window slammed. And from the edge of the square, she spotted Arnold Dacre himself, emerging from the solicitor's office and lighting a cigarette with hands that fumbled. She rose and crossed toward him gently. "Mr. Dacre," she said with a grandmotherly tilt of her head, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a few words." He looked surprised, then wary, but nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple." "I expect the constable asked already, but I've been thinking of that curious clock. Did Mr. Glynn tell you much about it?" Arnold exhaled smoke toward the ground. "Only that it was rare. He said it had belonged to a French noble family, something rather grim." Grim. There was a tale attached, that it had been present during several sudden deaths. Bad luck, he said. A bit of melodrama, really. "And yet it made you nervous." Arnold stared at her. "You noticed that?" Miss Marple's smile deepened only slightly. "One notices when one knits." He laughed, but the sound didn't last. "It just reminded me of something. Years ago. My father, he had dealings with Mr. Glynn. Bought something off him. A paperweight, I think. There was a row. I was a child. But I remember, Mr. Glynn said something about never again letting sentiment spoil justice. My father threw the object into the fire." Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. "Justice?" Arnold shrugged. "He was always cryptic. But I don't think Mr. Glynn forgot slights." She thanked him and left him standing beneath the sign of the old solicitor, staring into nothing. Back in her cottage that evening, Miss Marple stirred her fire and opened her notebook. A name had begun to form at the edge of her thoughts. Not a modern one, not someone from the fate, but someone from further back. Someone who might explain why a clock would be the chosen relic for a murder. Or even why its silence mattered more than its value. She wrote, "Beatrice Glynn, died 1921. Suitor unknown. Arnold's father involved in quarrel. Mrs. Eastgate, comfort or concealment. Clock equals link between past death and current crime." Then she folded the notebook shut. Something about the death was theatrical, yes, but restrained. Not a crime of heat, but of planning. Not revenge, not quite, not grief. A kind of accounting, perhaps. One that had taken years to balance. And somewhere, buried in the polite quiet of this village, was the person who believed the clock had kept perfect time all along. Miss Marple, however, knew better. Some clocks ticked silently, but they still ticked, and they still struck when the hour came. The next day brought a change in the weather. Clouds hung low over Charnley Street. Mary, muting the edges of the hedgerows and softening the sharpness of sunlight. It was the sort of morning that discouraged activity, yet heightened attention. The village, always inclined to chatter, now whispered, as though afraid the walls might overhear. At the police station, more of a glorified office above the greengrocer's, Inspector Crispin had arrived from the county to take over the matter of Mr. Glynn's death. He was a tall, angular man, with eyes like pebbles and a voice that made simple questions feel like cross-examinations. Miss Marple had encountered his sort before. He did not welcome suggestion, only confirmation. She was not invited in immediately. Instead, she took a purposeful walk through the lane that led past the old Glynn Antiques shop, now shuttered and silent. The lace curtains were drawn across the front window, but Miss Marple paused before the door all the same. On the step, something caught her eye. Just a scrap of paper half tucked beneath the mat. She knelt, careful not to appear nosy, and retrieved it. The ink had run slightly from the morning dew, but she could still make out the words, "No price can be placed on guilt." There was no signature, only the faint indentation of a crest at the top, E.G. The stationery was expensive. She tucked it quietly into her pocketbook and continued on. By the time she reached the police station, the village clock had just struck 10. Constable Greaves met her on the stairs, looking faintly harassed. Miss Marple, he said, clearly relieved. Inspector Crispin's in with the vicar just now, but he asked if you'd wait. I think he wants your impressions. Miss Marple's brows lifted a fraction. How gracious. Perhaps I'll take a moment on the bench out front. The bench offered a good view of the street, and Miss Marple used it wisely. 2 deliveries came and went, including a telegram boy who looked flustered and pale. Mrs. Eastgate crossed the square, glancing over her shoulder as though pursued. And then Arnold Dacre appeared again, this time without cigarette, walking briskly but aimlessly, as if from habit rather than direction. When at last Inspector Crispin emerged, his expression was neutral, but his eyes sharp. Miss Marple, he said without greeting. They tell me you were present at the fete and witnessed Mr. Glyn's final moments. I was, she replied gently, though I fear I witnessed little. Death is often quiet, in my experience. Yes, and that's the trouble. No struggle, no sign of panic. Doctor says it may have been poisoning. We'll know once the toxicology report returns. But until then, we ask questions. She inclined her head. May I ask whether any suspects have emerged? He narrowed his gaze. Everyone and no one. Mr. Glyn seems to have had a talent for irritating his neighbours. Still, motive's one thing. Opportunity is another. Indeed, said Miss Marple. Though I would caution against viewing opportunity in too narrow a sense. After all, one doesn't need to be in the room to place a finger on the hour hand. Crispin gave her a long look. If you have something specific to say, Miss Marple, I'd prefer it plain. Plainness, she said with a trace of a smile, is often the last stage of understanding. I've found that small details, gently observed, tend to yield more than premature conclusions. He sighed. Then let me ask you plainly. Do you believe Mr. Glyn was murdered? I believe, said Miss Marple, that he died at a moment of great emotional significance, both to himself and to someone else. And such things, Inspector, are rarely coincidences. She left him then, with that sentence hanging between them like a question mark. Outside, the clouds had thickened further. She turned her steps toward the vicarage. Mrs. Hale received her with the careful politeness of a woman who had already brewed 3 pots of tea that morning and hoped this would not require a 4th. But Miss Marple asked only for 5 minutes in the drawing room where the death had occurred. The room had not changed, except that the flowers had wilted and the clock had been removed. Miss Marple stood quietly in the middle of the carpet, her hands folded. It's odd, she said aloud, though no one was with her. To remove the very object that bore no blood, no blame, but all the attention. She moved toward the sideboard, studying the spot where the clock had rested. A slight ring of dust, unbrushed, but something else caught her eye. The faintest impression of a rectangular shape beside it, as though another object had been removed at the same time. Not large, perhaps a box. She stepped back and let her gaze travel to the window. It overlooked the garden, but more crucially, the path that led round to the back of the vicarage, where, during the fete, trays of lemonade and sandwiches had been circulated. Anyone could have slipped in. Anyone might have planted something, or removed something else. She turned and left, with a new resolve taking shape. Instead of returning home, she walked straight to the small annex that housed the Morton Historical Society archives. It was staffed twice a week by a nervous man named Giles Hartling, who admired Miss Marple in the way earnest men admire discipline disguised as charm. I wonder, she said as she stepped inside, if you might help me locate some information on the Glyn family, specifically the sister, Beatrice. Giles's eyebrows rose. Tragic that. Drowned in 1921. But yes, I believe we have a few clippings and possibly a letter or two. Her fiancé was a young man from a nearby estate, though I believe the match was opposed. Do you remember his name? Elliot Gresham. His family were minor gentry, but there was talk of debts, and I think there was a scandal shortly after her death. He vanished, I believe, left for Canada. Miss Marple felt the stir of certainty then. Not full yet, not finished, but stirring. She reviewed the clippings as Giles retrieved them. A photograph of Beatrice Glynn, pale and serious. A newspaper column reporting her mysterious drowning under unclear circumstances. And finally, a letter. Unsigned, but unmistakably written in the same hand as the note she'd found beneath Mr. Glynn's doormat. The past may be buried beneath water, but time has a way of surfacing what was never laid to rest. I cannot forget, nor forgive. She left the archives just after 3, the note safely tucked into her knitting bag. She had no intention of showing it to Inspector Crispin just yet. There were still pieces to assemble, still questions to be gently placed where answers might rise of their own accord. That evening, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, her own clock ticking audibly beside her. The pieces were arranging themselves now. A death that mimicked a long-ago tragedy, a family grudge disguised as sentiment, and a clock that ticked without sound, perhaps like guilt itself, long hidden, never quite still. She picked up her pen and wrote. Gresham equals initials on note. Clock. Was it his, given or stolen? What did Mr. Glynn remove from the drawing room? A letter? A will? Motives? Penelope, attachment. Arnold, inheritance. Gresham, revenge. She sat back and listened to the quiet of her room. Outside, the church bell rang softly for evensong. Inside, only one sound persisted, the soft, steady ticking of a clock that did not hide its truth. The following morning brought the first drops of rain. It came in a fine, persistent mist that clung to window panes and softened every sound in Charnley Street. Mary, rendering the village a little quieter, a little more introspective. Even the birdsong seemed dampened, as though the hedgerows themselves were holding their breath. Miss Marple, wrapped in a neatly buttoned raincoat with her umbrella balanced delicately on her forearm, made her way to the post office with more purpose than usual. She had a letter to post, yes. But more importantly, she had a conversation to initiate. Not with the postmistress, who was more interested in the weight of parcels than the secrets behind them, but with the woman who arrived just after Miss Marple stepped inside, shaking water from her coat like a bird ruffling its feathers. Mrs. Eastgate, Miss Marple said pleasantly. How damp we are. The sort of rain that gets in behind your spectacles. Penelope Eastgate blinked, then offered a small, tired smile. Her eyes were puffy and her complexion wan. I suppose I didn't notice, she murmured. I've had rather a full morning. Miss Marple did not press. Instead, she paid for her stamps, stepped aside, and began folding her umbrella, giving Mrs. Eastgate the chance to speak first. I'm afraid I didn't sleep, Penelope offered after a moment. The fate, and then everything after. I keep thinking about the way Mr. Glynn fell, as though someone had pulled his strings loose. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, and yet it was so quiet. Death can be like that, unshowy, decisive. I sometimes think it knows when it's intruding and behaves accordingly. Penelope gave a thin laugh. You have a way of putting things, Miss Marple. They stepped out into the lane together, and Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift like the mist around them. I understand you were quite friendly with Mr. Glynn, she said lightly, in recent months. I wouldn't say that, Penelope said quickly, but then her face softened. We talked. After Andrew died, I found it difficult to speak to people who always looked at me as though I might break. Mr. Glynn didn't ask for much. He'd grumble, of course, but then he'd listen. He let silence sit without apology. That's a rare gift, Miss Marple said. Penelope was silent for a few steps. Then, he told me once that silence is where the truth hides. I thought he meant grief, but now I wonder. You asked about the clock, Miss Marple said gently, before the raffle began. Penelope stopped walking. I did. I had no intention of buying it. Lord knows I haven't the room, but I felt it was a strange piece to display. I thought it might stir things that had long been put away. And did it? Yes, she said faintly, but not in the way I imagined. It didn't make people talk. It made them retreat. Do you know what it feels like, Miss Marple, to realize you're not the only one haunted by something? That others carry it too, and pretend better than you do? Miss Marple's expression softened. It is often the best pretenders who hurt the most. Penelope looked away, her mouth tight. He showed me something once. A letter. I think he meant to destroy it. I told him not to. I told him, sometimes guilt deserves to be remembered. A letter? Miss Marple asked gently. Would it have had initials? E.G., perhaps? Penelope's eyes widened. How did you… I found a note on his doorstep, Miss Marple said calmly. It seems someone else shared your view. Penelope looked down at her gloved hands. Then it's begun. Whatever it is. I don't know who sent it, Miss Marple. I swear I don't. But whoever did, it was meant to unearth something. It already has, Miss Marple said. One death and many suspicions. They parted a moment later, and Miss Marple made her way slowly to the rectory, where Reverend Hale had left word she might come by if she wished to review the church records, ostensibly in relation to the cemetery project. She was greeted by the housemaid, who showed her into the study with tea and ginger biscuits. Miss Marple sat not at the desk, but beside the hearth, her eyes drifting slowly over the bookcases, the small china clock on the mantel, the umbrella stand in the corner. It was a room built for listening, high-ceilinged and echo-prone. She suspected many truths had bounced off its wainscoting. Reverend Hale joined her shortly, all spectacles and warmth. I don't suppose you've come just for burials, Miss Marple, he said kindly, though I'd never accuse you of false pretenses. No, she said, though I do find burials often precede quite a bit of truth. He sighed, folding his hands. It's a dreadful thing. Gerald Glynn was not easy, but he was trying in his way. And now everyone is watching everyone else, wondering who had the most reason. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Tell me, Reverend, do you recall officiating the funeral of Beatrice Glynn? He looked startled, then sat back. My father did, not I. I was away at seminary when she died. But it cast a long shadow. My mother used to say that Charnley turned inward after that summer. Did you know who she was engaged to? Not formally, no, but there were whispers. A young man from Morton, Elliot Gresham. He vanished not long after. His family faced ruin, I believe. The two matters were quietly entwined in people's minds, though no one ever spoke it aloud. That was the way of things. Miss Marple nodded. And Mr. Glynn? He never spoke of her, not once. But he began collecting almost obsessively afterward. Clocks, trinkets, objects with histories. Some said he was preserving time. Others thought he was trying to lock it away. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Would it surprise you to know that the clock he displayed at the fete, the silent one, may have once belonged to the Gresham family? Reverend Hale went still. No, he said slowly. It doesn't surprise me at all. But it frightens me, Miss Marple, because that would mean he'd kept something that tied him directly to that summer. And someone else has remembered it too. Miss Marple left not long after, her mind spinning with new weight. The rain had eased, but the village air still held that saturated heaviness. She returned home to find a note slipped beneath her own door, unsigned, written in a hand she did not yet recognize. You see it too, but you mustn't speak yet. Let the truth finish its shape. She held it for a long time, the paper trembling just slightly in her hand. The pattern was emerging now, too slow for the police, too quiet for headlines, but clear to her. Someone had waited years for a moment when guilt might be exposed with precision. Someone who had not forgotten Beatrice Glynn. Someone who knew that clocks could speak even when they made no sound at all. And Miss Marple, ever careful, ever exact, now knew the next step was not to ask, but to watch. For in watching, the truth would finally come forward, not like a confession, but like a hand reaching from behind time, pressing gently against the glass. That evening, the mist returned, not with the damp insistence of the morning, but in soft veils that drifted along the hedges like something searching. Lights came on early in the windows of Charnley Street. Mary, drawn curtains turning houses into lanterns against the fog. But in number 2 Church Lane, Miss Marple kept hers undrawn, content to watch the street grow dim. She had not replied to the note. She had placed it beside the earlier one, no price can be placed on guilt, and studied them both under her reading lamp, side by side. Different hands, yes. But similar turns of thought. Someone was watching not just the investigation but her. That note was not a warning. It was permission, or perhaps invitation. She took out her notebook again and looked at what she had already written. Then carefully, she added a line beneath the name Elliot Gresham. Still in village? Identity concealed? She did not yet know who had sent the note, but she had begun to form an idea of who had not. Mrs. Eastgate, for instance, too open, too frightened. Arnold Dacre, too reactive, his guilt second-hand. Inherited, perhaps, but not purposeful. The killer, she was convinced, was not someone reacting in panic. This was a performance, something long written, rehearsed, and now playing to a final cue. She sat back. A shadow passed her window, not a figure, just movement. She rose without hurry, stepped outside, and looked up and down the lane. Nothing. Just fog. But across the road, a light blinked in the vicarage attic, a flicker, as if someone had passed in front of a lamp. Strange, as the vicar and his wife were known to retire early, and the attic was used only for storage. Miss Marple returned indoors, stirred her fire, and made one quiet decision. She would visit the attic before the morning came. The opportunity arrived sooner than she expected. The next afternoon, under the pretext of returning a hymnal she had borrowed from the rectory library, she called upon Mrs. Hale. The woman was fussing with vases in the parlour, her mind clearly elsewhere, and welcomed Miss Marple in with distracted warmth. "Oh, the hymnals," she said, waving one hand vaguely. "Yes, just pop it into the vestibule, dear. Or you can leave it upstairs. We've been sorting through the storage rooms lately, trying to find space for the fate decorations. Everything ends up in the attic eventually." Miss Marple smiled. "Then perhaps I'll save you the walk." She climbed the narrow stairway slowly, listening to the groan of each step. The attic door was unlocked, the handle cold. Inside, the space smelled of beeswax and old linen. The window that had glowed last night was half covered with a sheet, the pane damp with condensation. Boxes lined the walls, church records, festival banners, dented platters from decades past. But what caught her attention was a small trunk tucked beneath the eaves, unlike the rest. It was leather, and the lock had been carefully removed, as though someone wanted it opened and closed often. She knelt and lifted the lid. Inside, neatly layered, old correspondence, bound with twine, a lady's glove, yellowed but still holding its shape, and at the very bottom, a photograph album. She opened it gently. A sepia portrait of Beatrice Glynn stared up at her. On the next page, a photograph of her and a man, young, suited, half turned from the camera. The inscription beneath, faded but legible, E.G. and B.G., Charnley Wood, August 1919. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly. The last few were blank. She closed the album and replaced it, carefully, but not before noting a sheet of paper tucked at the back of the trunk's lid. A letter, partially folded. She read only the opening. "You buried her once, Gerald. But I see the clock now, and I remember the way she looked at you that day. This time, the past answers back." She did not pocket it. She left it there, for it belonged to someone else now, the inspector perhaps, or a conscience long deferred. But she had seen enough. As she came down the stairs, Mrs. Hale called from the kitchen. "Find everything all right?" "Perfectly," Miss Marple replied. Quite the archive you have up there. Mrs. Hale laughed. The attic knows more village history than we do. It's a wonder the roof holds under the weight of secrets. That night, the wind rose. The fog cleared, but the wind took its place, rattling window latches and tugging at gutters, as though some force had grown restless. Miss Marple sat in her drawing room, the fire banked low, thinking. Elliot Gresham, dead or returned? The letter's tone was too intimate to have come from a stranger, too knowing to be composed after reading a newspaper article. And there was something else. The deliberate placement of the clock at the fete. Gerald Glynn hadn't merely displayed it. He had announced it, as though daring the past to notice. But someone else had noticed first. Someone had come to Charnley Street. Mary under another name, or from a forgotten corner, to finish what had begun by the millstream 30 years earlier. They hadn't killed in haste. They'd waited for the moment when silence would be loudest. The following morning, Inspector Crispin called on Miss Marple. She offered him tea. He declined. "We've received the toxicology report," he said without preamble. "It was digitalis." Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. "Ingested," he went on, "but not in drink or food. Administered via contact. A tincture applied to the winding mechanism of the clock. When Mr. Glynn demonstrated it, winding it by hand, he would have absorbed it through the skin. Ingenious, if you believe in patience and planning." "And someone did," said Miss Marple. Crispin looked at her narrowly. "You seem ahead of me." "Only slightly. I suspect you'll find fingerprints on the inside of the clock case that don't belong to Mr. Glynn, or perhaps no fingerprints at all if gloves were worn, but the residue of an older varnish wiped away. The person who did this wasn't just trying to poison. They were making something symbolic." Crispin shifted. "And you think this links to his sister?" "I think it's the only way to explain the precision," said Miss Marple. "He was a man who collected time, who tried to trap it. But guilt moves differently. It doesn't stay locked in glass. It ticks silently, until someone winds it back. Do you have a name?" "Not yet," she said. "But I believe we're looking in the wrong place. We're watching those nearest to Mr. Glynn, when we should be watching those nearest to Beatrice. Whoever loved her, or lost her. Whoever believed her death was caused, not by accident, but by betrayal." Crispin stood slowly. "You believe the killer's still here?" Miss Marple's gaze held his. "I believe they've been here all along, and I believe they think this isn't murder. I believe they think it's justice." Outside, the wind had quieted, but a tension lingered, low and taut across the rooftops of Charnley Street. Mary. The next strike of the silent clock, Miss Marple knew, would not be physical. It would be spoken. Someone would say too much, or not enough. But either way, the final hour had already begun. The storm passed in the night, leaving the village washed and brittle under a cold sun. Leaves clung to the cobbles in damp mosaics, and the church bell echoed through the clear air with startling clarity. It was the kind of morning that laid things bare, and in Charnley Street Mary, it laid bare nerves, memories, and intentions. Miss Marple had risen early. She sat now at her desk, sifting through her notes while the kettle hummed behind her. Names, phrases, and observations, none overt, none conclusive, but the shape was becoming clearer. The silent clock had been not just a murder weapon, but a message, a summoning bell for old guilt. She had been watching faces. The past few days, no visitor to the village green, no passerby at the shops, had escaped her notice. And one face in particular, familiarly unfamiliar, had begun to trouble her. Not because it was suspicious in itself, but because it was out of place in time. A man who moved as though he knew the village too well to be new, and too poorly to be honest. He had been at the fete, she was certain of it now, lingering behind the cello duet, keeping his distance from the raffle. She had seen him again yesterday by the bookstall, pretending to fumble with a pamphlet, not speaking to anyone, but listening to everyone. She left her cottage that morning, not for the post office or the church, but for the Green Hart Inn. It was the only lodging house in the village, and while its rooms were small and its wallpaper tired, it offered anonymity for those who needed it. Mrs. Webb, the innkeeper, was a woman of generous girth and even more generous opinions. She greeted Miss Marple with the suspicion usually reserved for health inspectors. "If it's the scones you've come about, I haven't had a complaint in 10 years. "I would never dare," said Miss Marple, smiling faintly. "I was merely wondering if you've had any unusual guests recently. Visitors who've not said where they're from." Mrs. Webb sniffed. "This isn't the Ritz. People don't come here for mystery. They come for plumbing that still rattles and beds that sag. Though," she paused, "now that you mention it, there's a man in the back room. Quiet, pays in cash. Name of Ellis, I think. Said he was tracing old family records, but he hasn't asked at the church nor the council office. Just takes long walks and keeps to himself." Miss Marple nodded. "Would you mind terribly if I left him a note? Just a few words. I believe he may be able to help me fill in a few gaps." Mrs. Webb looked at her, considered, and finally nodded toward the counter where the room keys hung. "Leave it on the tray by room 3, she said. "But don't say I encouraged anything." Miss Marple took a small envelope from her bag, already prepared. Inside, just a short message, written in her tidy hand. "Some truths do not expire. If you wish to speak, come to the churchyard at 3:30. Alone." She signed it simply, J.M. By the time she returned home, the afternoon had settled into a pale stillness. She waited, not knitting, not making tea, but sitting very still, watching the light move across the floor. At 3:15 she rose, took her coat, and walked to the churchyard. She did not wait long. He arrived from the east path, shoulders hunched against a wind that no longer blew. A man in his early 60s, lean, with a face not memorable in itself, but marked by a kind of inward weariness. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then, "You're cleverer than most," he said. "I'm older than most," she replied. "That gives one an unfair advantage." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "You know who I am?" "I believe so, though it's not your name that matters. It's the weight of what you carry." He looked at the nearest gravestone and did not meet her eyes. "I was going to leave after the fete," he said quietly. "I thought seeing the clock would be enough, a kind of conclusion." "But it wasn't," she said gently. He shook his head. He was still proud of it, as if what happened to Beatrice had been a lesson for others, not a guilt for him. Miss Marple's voice was soft. "You were engaged to her." He looked at her then, and there was no surprise in his eyes. "Yes. Her brother disapproved, said I'd ruin her, that I was unworthy. He threatened to disinherit her, said she was fragile, needed guidance. I thought she'd stand up to him. She tried. But something happened, some fight we never understood, and then she was gone." He paused, pressing his hand against the old stone beside him. "There was no inquest verdict. They found her in the mill pond. Slipped, they said. But she never went walking there alone. She hated the reeds. Gerald told the police he hadn't seen her that day. But he had. I know he had. And the clock? It was a gift, from me to her. I had it made while I was working in Paris. Silent, elegant, rare. She loved it. But after she died, it disappeared. I thought it was lost. And then, 30 years later, I saw it again, in his shop window, with no explanation, no shame." Miss Marple was quiet. "You left," she said. "After the funeral. Your family was collapsing, yes, but you also couldn't bear to stay." "I would have gone mad staying," he said, "but I never stopped thinking about it. And when I saw the clock again, I felt that perhaps it was time someone heard what had gone unsaid." "But you didn't kill him." His eyes flickered. "No," he said, after a long pause. "I came to confront him, but I wasn't the only one watching. I saw someone in his shop before the fete, someone adjusting the clock, I thought they worked for him. But when he died, I knew. Someone else had wanted this reckoning too. Miss Marple looked down at the path between them, where the pebbles had shifted in the breeze. Do you know who? He hesitated. I think I do, but it would be complicated. It always is, she said gently. I didn't come to stir things up, he said, stepping back. I just wanted to see it, to see the clock once more, and remind myself that she'd loved something beautiful, that she'd loved me, even if the rest of the world tried to forget. Miss Marple gave him a long, level look. You reminded the village that the past does not stay buried simply because we've stopped mentioning it. You reminded someone else that guilt, left unchecked, becomes rot. He nodded once and turned to go. As he passed through the church gate, Miss Marple did not call after him. She turned instead to the graves, walking slowly now, her mind full of names and faces, all rearranging themselves again. Someone had seen him arrive, someone had known who he was, and someone, fearing what would surface, had decided to strike first. She knelt beside a stone overgrown with ivy and whispered to no one in particular. You still have secrets, don't you, Beatrice? Behind her, the bell rang the hour, 4, low and solemn. The hour of understanding was drawing close. And Miss Marple, who had watched the village with the same quiet vigilance as that deadly little clock, knew. The final tick was near. By the next morning, the village had grown restless in that peculiarly English way, restless in whispers, in sideways glances over teacups, in long pauses between greetings that used to be breezy. There was no second death, no further alarm. But the unease hung thicker than fog ever could. What had once been a tidy narrative, a sudden death at a garden fete, perhaps a heart attack, perhaps a stroke, had begun to unravel, thread by slow thread, until everyone understood, without being told outright, that something darker had taken root. Miss Marple, calm and as neatly pressed as ever, stepped into the vicarage that morning with a quiet purpose. She had not come for tea, though the vicar's wife offered it, and she had not come to make conversation, though the vicar offered that too. She asked instead to speak with both of them in the study, together. It was a gentle request, but it left no room for refusal. The Reverend Hale sat stiffly beside his wife as Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. She glanced once toward the ceiling, where she imagined the attic and the trunk that still contained the photograph album and the letter, the one she had chosen not to remove. I believe, she said gently, that someone has been in your attic more than once in recent weeks. Someone searching for something. Margaret Hale's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Her husband's brows furrowed. Old records mostly, he said. Some local interest volunteers have come in and out. Margaret arranged it, I think, for the fete display. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. And yet I wonder if one of those visitors, perhaps not a volunteer at all, came to see something else. Perhaps a photograph or a letter left behind and forgotten by the man who once helped with church matters long ago. Margaret's hand shifted slightly in her lap. What do you mean? I mean, said Miss Marple, that someone close to Gerald Glynn once had access to this house. Someone who might have known where he left things. Someone who, though not formally tied to him, bore a bond from years before. Margaret stared at her, mouth parted. You see, Miss Marple continued, I believe Mr. Glynn once confided in you. Margaret flushed. Miss Marple, Not recently, she said kindly. Long ago. Perhaps when you were much younger. Perhaps you were even the person who found Beatrice Glynn that day. A tremor passed through the woman, like a gust across still water. No, she whispered. I didn't find her. But I knew. Reverend Hale looked sharply at his wife. Margaret! She was my friend, she said, voice barely audible. We were girls together, Beatrice and I. She told me things she never told anyone else, that she was afraid of Gerald, that she loved someone her brother disapproved of, that he said she was embarrassing the family, and she had to end it. I begged her to come away with me, but she wouldn't. And then she looked down, her shoulders slumped. I didn't say anything, not to the police, not even to my own mother. And then Gerald Glynn moved on as though nothing had happened. He became respectable. The antiques, the clocks, it all made people forget. But I didn't. I kept what she gave me, her photograph, her letter. I couldn't throw them away. Reverend Hale sat motionless, as though history had walked into his study and sat down beside his wife without knocking. Miss Marple's voice was low and even. And recently, someone else found them. Someone who had been waiting for justice. Not vengeance, perhaps, but reckoning. Are you saying, Margaret whispered, that someone murdered Gerald because of Beatrice? I am, said Miss Marple. And I believe whoever did it saw those letters, or knew where they were, or more likely, remembered them being stored here long ago. Because the person who killed Mr. Glynn would have needed a reason and a method. The method was the clock. The reason was the memory. Margaret blinked rapidly, her eyes filling. Then it's my fault. I should have destroyed them. No, Miss Marple said softly. You preserved the truth. You did what you could in a time when women were not often believed. The vicar reached for his wife's hand and held it. I believe, Miss Marple continued, the final piece is almost within reach. But there is still a shadow. Someone who believed that silence was not enough. And that person, I suspect, is watching now. Watching us. She stood, smoothing her skirt. If they've not fled already, they'll make a mistake soon. Not in what they say, but in what they avoid. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a visit from Inspector Crispin. He looked tired, as though the village itself had worn him down more than any suspect could. He sat in her parlour, tea untouched, brow furrowed. The man you met in the churchyard, he said. The one calling himself Ellis. Gone. Left the Green Hart Inn this morning. I'm not surprised, Miss Marple replied. He never meant to stay, only to witness something. Crispin gave a dry huff. He certainly saw something. I checked the clock. No fingerprints, as predicted, but a smudge of tincture near the winding key, almost invisible. The coroner says it was enough, administered at most an hour before the fate. So someone had access, Miss Marple said. Someone who knew the clock would be handled publicly, and who knew how to mask the act as misfortune. The inspector leaned forward. I need more, Miss Marple. Suspicion isn't enough. I've got motive. I've got opportunity. But I don't yet have intent. Then we must draw it out, she said. And for that, we need a scene. He frowned. A scene. A stage, Inspector. A final act, where the players are present, the audience unsuspecting, and the guilty made just uncomfortable enough to speak too soon. She paused, her eyes glittering. Call a memorial, she said. A gathering in Mr. Glynn's honour. Let it appear to be about mourning. But make it a mirror, and whoever looks into it and sees only their own reflection, that will be the one who cannot bear it. Crispin sat back. You're suggesting we bait them? No, Inspector. I'm suggesting we give them a choice. Either remain silent forever, or confess, publicly or otherwise. The next morning, the vicar's notice board bore a new flyer. A service of remembrance for Gerald Glynn, to be held Thursday at 4 p.m. in the church hall. By noon, the village was buzzing. Some whispered it was indecent, too soon. Others said it was the least they could do. But all agreed they would attend. And Miss Marple, seated at her window, watching the birds tug threads from the hedge, knew. The clock had nearly struck its last silent note. Only one voice was left to be heard. And that voice, when it finally spoke, would unravel the whole story. Not because it wanted to, but because it no longer could endure the weight of having stayed quiet for so long. The church hall had not been this full since the Queen's coronation broadcast. The chairs were arranged in neat rows beneath the bunting that still hung from the fat, now faded and listing slightly. At the front, A table draped in white linen held a modest arrangement of chrysanthemums and a framed photograph of Gerald Glynn in his younger years, the kind chosen to soften memory and omit sharpness. It didn't quite work. He still looked like a man whose smile had been practiced once and abandoned halfway through. The service had not yet begun. Villagers settled into their seats with the cautious quiet of people who weren't entirely sure whether they'd come to mourn or to spectate. Miss Marple, seated near the aisle in her usual dove-grey ensemble, observed it all with the same quiet attention she'd brought to the fete. She noted where people sat. Penelope Eastgate, 3 rows from the front, alone and rigid. Arnold Dacre, leaning back against a pillar, arms folded, face closed. Margaret Hale seated beside her husband, unusually pale. And near the back, a woman who hadn't been seen at all the day before, Miss Letitia Gray, who ran the bookstall and rarely spoke above a whisper, now sitting bolt upright with her gloves still on. Inspector Crispin stood near the side wall, pretending to examine the hymnal board. He hadn't brought uniformed constables, but there was one plain-clothed man near the doors. Just in case. The vicar, composed but visibly strained, stepped up to the lectern at 4 o'clock sharp and cleared his throat. We are gathered to remember a man who, whatever our feelings, was part of our community. Gerald Glynn was not easy, but he was persistent, steadfast. He loved beautiful things and sought to preserve them, and in doing so, perhaps, sought also to preserve parts of himself. Miss Marple watched the room more than she listened. Grief was not the dominant emotion. Discomfort was. Some faces turned to the floor. Some sat unusually still. No tears were shed. When the vicar invited reflections from the attendees, there was the expected pause, longer than it should have been, heavy with reluctance. And then, to everyone's surprise, it was Penelope Eastgate who rose. She walked slowly to the front, her heels careful on the floorboards. When she turned to face the room, her expression was unreadable. "I didn't know Mr. Glynn well," she began, voice thin but steady. "But I spoke with him often these past months. I think he wanted to tell me something he couldn't quite say. About his sister, about what had happened. He never did, but I could feel the weight of it in him." She glanced at Miss Marple, just once, and then down at her hands. "I think we forget, sometimes, that silence isn't peace. It's pressure. And one day it turns into something else." She returned to her seat. No one applauded, but a few heads nodded. The room settled again. The vicar invited one more speaker. And then, from the back of the hall, Letitia Gray stood. She had to walk the length of the aisle. She did so with an odd dignity, her gloves still on, her coat buttoned high despite the heat of the room. When she turned to face the assembly, something in her expression had shifted. "I wasn't going to speak," she said. "I never have, not about any of it. But if this is a memorial, then let it be one." She paused. Her voice didn't tremble, but her hands did. "I was Beatrice Glynn's friend once. Before she died. I knew what she was planning, to run away. She came to me the night before she drowned. She brought a small bag and said she would meet Elliot the next morning near the mill path. She asked if she could leave the clock with me for safekeeping. Said it reminded her too much of things she didn't want to think about, but she was proud of it. He had given it to her, and she didn't want it lost." The room was utterly still. Miss Marple felt the tension click forward like a gear inside a watch. "I kept the clock," Letitia went on, "for a little while. And then one day it was gone. Gerald came to my house, said he was settling her affairs, said he was claiming what had been hers. I let him take it. I was frightened." She inhaled deeply. "And I stayed frightened, for 30 years, until I saw the clock again, sitting in his shop window like a trophy. That's when I understood. He wasn't grieving. He was displaying." Her hands curled around the lectern edge. "I didn't kill him, but I wanted someone to ask why he died, not just how. And when I saw the fate notice, and saw the name of the piece he would be displaying. I knew someone else hadn't forgotten either. She stepped back, her face blank, and returned to her seat without another word. The vicar stood awkwardly. There were no more speakers, no final hymn. Inspector Crispin moved first, gently stepping forward. "Miss Gray," he said, "you kept the clock? Do you still have it?" Letitia's mouth twitched. "Number I gave it away 2 weeks ago." "To whom?" She looked at Miss Marple and then down. "I left it at the vicarage, in the attic." A breath passed through the room like wind. Margaret Hale closed her eyes. Miss Marple rose quietly and turned to face the hall. "I believe," she said, "we now understand the shape of things. 3 women, each carrying a piece of what happened to Beatrice Glynn. One who preserved her words, one who kept her gift, and one who received her confidences. None of them could see the full picture. Not until the clock returned." She turned toward Arnold Dacre, who had not moved. "Mr. Dacre, I wonder if you might answer a question. Your father, did he ever speak of Beatrice Glynn?" Arnold's jaw tightened. "No." "Yet you were present at Mr. Glynn's shop the day he received the clock." He stared at her. "Yes, I recognized it. My father had once tried to buy it, years after her death. Gerald refused, said it wasn't for sale. But my father told me why. Said the clock had once belonged to her, and that Gerald would never part with it, not because it reminded him of his sister, but because it reminded him that he had won." The room exhaled. Arnold stood abruptly and left without a word. Crispin didn't stop him. He watched him go, then turned to Miss Marple. "Do you believe she, Miss Gray, was the one who applied the poison?" "No," said Miss Marple. "I believe she meant only to return the clock. She didn't kill Gerald Glynn, but someone else, watching all this unfold, saw an opportunity. Someone with access to the vicarage. Someone who knew the clock would be wound by hand." She looked at Margaret Hale. The vicar's wife met her gaze for a long moment, then rose and walked out of the hall. No one followed. Inspector Crispin sighed. "It won't be quick, or easy." "No," Miss Marple said, "but it will be done." The room was dispersing, conversation bubbling up at last, now that silence had done its work. Outside, the sun was dipping behind the hills. A breeze moved through the churchyard, lifting the edges of the programme sheets, fluttering across the path. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the gate, her steps light, her hands folded. Behind her, the world shifted back toward order, but she knew that in one attic and one conscience, the ticking would continue for a while longer. Not silent now, but steady, as all reckonings must be. The days that followed the memorial moved with a strange, watchful quiet. Charnley Street Mary, never one to let anything lie undiscussed, seemed to avoid the subject of Gerald Glynn altogether, as though by willing him out of their conversations they might untangle themselves from the web of his final days. But the silence, once manufactured and cooperative, now felt raw and ragged. The village could feel the shift. Something had broken open and refused to close again. Miss Marple, however, was not idle. She had walked past the vicarage 3 times that week, not out of aimless routine, but to study its pattern. Once in the early morning, once at dusk, and once mid-afternoon. The curtains were drawn more tightly now. The front steps were cleaner than usual, as though someone had scrubbed them to erase invisible stains. And on the second afternoon, she noted the absence of birdsong around the house entirely. It was a stillness that felt like the moment before confession, or collapse. Inside number 2 Church Lane, she had made only one new entry in her notebook. Not a name, not a theory. Just a line. She did not intend to kill. But she intended him to suffer. That was the distinction Miss Marple had come to recognize. Margaret Hale, burdened for 3 decades with the knowledge that Beatrice had died not merely by accident, but by despair, and perhaps worse, had kept her silence like a moral duty. But silence is not static. It changes with time. It accumulates friction. And in Margaret, it had not erupted, but decayed slowly, Until one day, when the clock returned like a ghost, she could no longer pretend that what had happened was buried. Margaret had not planned murder in the traditional sense. Miss Marple did not believe she had measured out Digitalis in a darkened room, nor plotted like a villain from a novel. But she had seen the clock, understood what it meant, and seen her moment. Perhaps she had found the tincture in an old cabinet in the vestry. Perhaps she had once assisted in its use for an elderly parishioner. She had not meant to kill him, just to remind him, on his skin, in his body, that what he had done would never disappear. But guilt, when disturbed, does not behave neatly, and poison does not take orders. Inspector Crispin had returned to the village 2 days after the memorial, his coat damp with London rain, and his temper worn thin. "I've spoken to the DPP," he said, seated stiffly across from Miss Marple's hearth. "We can't prosecute on suspicion and psychology alone. There's no direct evidence, no witness, no fingerprint, no note of confession." "No," said Miss Marple, stirring her tea. "But that doesn't mean we do nothing." He eyed her. "You're not thinking of confronting her?" "I already have," she said simply. The day after the service, she had left a note at the vicarage, addressed only to M. It contained nothing accusatory, only a single sentence. "Some burdens are too heavy to be carried in silence. If you wish to place yours down, I will be at home after tea." No one came. But that evening, long after the village had dimmed into quiet, she found another note in her letterbox. Folded without envelope, no name, no date. It read, "He never said he was sorry. Not once. I thought he might say it before the end, but he just smiled. It was not guilt. It was grief. Not for Mr. Glynn, but for the years that had been stolen. Not only from Beatrice, but from every woman who'd known the truth and lived in silence because of it." Miss Marple did not share the note with the inspector. "I believe the village knows," she said instead. "They may not speak of it, but they know. And Margaret Hale will carry the rest of it herself, with or without the law." Inspector Crispin said nothing for a while. Then, reluctantly, "You do have a talent for difficult conclusions, Miss Marple." "I only follow human nature," she said. "It rarely lies, and when it tries to, it does so clumsily." He rose, thanked her for the tea, and left without asking for any more. The days turned colder. Leaves thickened along the lanes. The fate bunting was finally taken down. The shop window at Glyn Antiques remained shuttered. Some said it would be sold to a couple from Somerset. Others said it should be left empty as a reminder. Miss Marple said nothing. She visited the churchyard one last time before the frost set in. She paused before the unmarked corner near the edge, the place where Beatrice Glynn had been buried without fanfare, her name remembered only in gossip and faded letters. Miss Marple laid down a single white rose, upright and fresh. Behind her, the village church stood quiet. The clock in the steeple ticked audibly, clear and unashamed. As she walked back along the lane, she passed Mrs. Eastgate sitting on her garden bench, a shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. "I wondered if you'd stop," the widow said without looking up. Miss Marple paused. "A little cold for lingering." Penelope smiled faintly. "I like to feel it. Reminds me I'm still here." They sat in companionable silence for a time, until Penelope spoke again. "I think we were all waiting," she said, "for something to be put right. But things don't get put right, do they?" "No," Miss Marple said softly, "but they do get seen. Sometimes that's the best we can do. I hope it's enough. For Beatrice, it may be." Penelope nodded. "And for Margaret. She's a vicar's wife. She'll hold herself together. But she'll never hear a ticking clock again without remembering what it means." The sun had lowered itself behind the hills. Miss Marple rose, adjusted her gloves, and bid the widow good evening. By the time she reached her gate, the village had quieted once more. Inside her sitting room, the only sound was the ticking of her small mantel clock. Audible, unhurried, precise. Not loud, but never silent. She did not stop it. She simply listened and let it be. The air in the village hall was thick with the residue of whispered conversations and half-turned glances, but now, at last, the room was quiet. The soft rustling of papers and the occasional creak of wooden chairs were the only sounds as Miss Marple rose slowly from her seat near the front. Her eyes swept over the assembled faces, some anxious, some weary, all waiting. She began softly. It has been said that time heals all wounds, but time, I have found, is also a keeper of secrets. It holds them close, silent, and waits for the right moment to reveal them. A pause. Then she continued. Gerald Glynn was a man haunted not only by the loss of his sister Beatrice, but by the guilt and silence that surrounded her death. That silence was a burden he bore alone, collecting clocks and relics as if to trap time itself, hoping to hold back the past. Her gaze settled on Margaret Hale, who sat rigid, the weight of unspoken years visible in her posture. Margaret, you kept the memories of Beatrice close, preserving letters and photographs that others might have destroyed. Your loyalty to a friend was admirable, but your silence allowed pain to fester. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she did not. Speak, Miss Marple continued. Yet it was not your hand that delivered the fatal tincture of digitalis. That was an act born of desperation, a silent accusation made through the clock itself, a symbol and a weapon. The poison was applied carefully, knowing Gerald would wind the clock, absorbing the fatal dose through his skin. She turned slightly toward Mrs. Eastgate. Penelope, your relationship with Gerald was complicated, filled with unspoken words and shared grief. You feared the clock and what it represented, yet you did not act against him. The room held its breath as Miss Marple's eyes finally rested on Arnold Dacre. Arnold, your family's history intertwined with the Glynn family through old disputes and debts. You carried the weight of inheritance and resentment, yet you too played no part in this final act. Her gaze softened. The truth lies with one who stood closest but was least suspected. Margaret Hale. Margaret looked up sharply, her face pale. Driven by decades of sorrow, regret, and the unbearable silence, you administered the poison not to kill in cold blood, but to force a reckoning, a confession from a man who never sought forgiveness. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Miss Marple folded her hands. Justice is not always about law or punishment, but about truth and understanding. Margaret, your actions were born of a heart burdened beyond measure. The law will decide your fate, but here, in this room, you have been seen. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks as she nodded slowly. The village exhaled collectively, the long-hidden secrets finally laid bare. Miss Marple lowered her gaze, a quiet resolve in her eyes. Time had spoken at last, through the ticking of a silent clock and the echoes of human frailty. And as the villagers dispersed into the crisp evening air, the mantel clock on Miss Marple's mantel ticked steadily, unobtrusive, honest, and true.